Hey guys, how's it going? Thanks for popping into the Othello Cinema today. Big news is I finally upgraded my projector. I've got the NZ700 from JVC in here now. It's been in here for, going on 4 weeks now, but I was out of town for one of those weeks. And I just finally, last week, had Kris Deering come in to calibrate it. He also brought along an NZ800 for the ride, which we had sitting here stacked on top of each other. We took some basic measurements to compare the 800 and the 700. And so I've got him, he'll be joining us in a little bit to tell us some of his overall impressions. I've got some of the data, the measurements that we've got, so stick around and we'll have some fun time nerd day data points. So after several years of paralysis by analysis, I finally made my decision and I ordered a JVC NZ700 to replace the trusty old X790R that I had in here. The longer throw distance, the larger screen, I needed more light output. So I went with the NZ700 and I got that in here just about a month ago. Like I said, I installed it. Put it up. I actually had it sitting right about where I'm sitting at first on a stand, just as a test before I took the other one down, just to make sure it was functioning properly. We watched a movie, instantly noticed the brightness and the sharpness, but it wasn't yet calibrated either. So I had to travel for about a week, and then when I got back, last week, as I mentioned, Kris Deering came out to calibrate it, and when he did, he also had another customer's NZ800 with him that we thought it would be fun to set them up, stack them, and get a little idea of how the new NZ700 compares to the NZ800, which is still a current new model, but it's been out there and in the wild for quite a bit longer. It's just been about a month or so that the 500 and the 700 have really started kind of hitting the customers' theaters. So we stacked those up and we measured them. Again, we didn't calibrate both of them in this room. I didn't want Kris to go through all that extra work, but before we calibrated mine, we calibrated the white point on both of them. And we took some basic measurements. So the first set of measurements, we set them up, we stacked them, and we aligned them on my screen with the same projected image size. So due to the difference in the throw range of these projectors, they're at a different spot in the zoom, but they are projecting an equal image. And that's where we're going to see this first set of numbers. The first set of measurements we took were just some basic contrast differences. We measured at 1%, 2%, 3, 4, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, and 30. If you look at this chart, you can see here at 1 and 2%, the NZ700 is outperforming the NZ800. But by the time you hit 3, the NZ800 pops ahead for a measurement or two, and then they just track really, really similarly all the way throughout the rest, all the way up to 30% windows. So taking a look here at the actual, the raw numbers that we measured, at the 1% window, the 700's up, 10,000 to 1 to 9271 to 1. But then as we get to 3%, the 800 pulls ahead by, a little bit here, 3167 to 2989. And then at 4%, they're almost dead even. It's like a 27, a difference of 27 there. 5%, they track very, very closely. The 700 begins to separate itself a little bit as we get towards 30%, but for the most part, these are tracking very, very, very closely. And so since that first set of measurements were taken at a different zoom setting to have the same size projected image, we wanted to test the extremes of the zoom on each lens. So rather than trying to match them on the screen, we took this first set of measurements here at the longest the longest throw setting of the zoom. The 700 comes in at 35,342. The 800 came in just a little bit below 33,000. And then we reset them to the shortest throw, and the NZ700 came in with 28,700. NZ800 had the 26,103 to 1 contrast. So for this last line here on this graphic, we used the longest throw setting. We closed down the aperture. We're using the calibrated white point. This is not raw off the lens. This is the calibrated white point. So both of them are down just a little bit for that already. But you see here, this is where the output of the 800 really comes into play. Where the 700 has a 66,923 to 1 contrast ratio. The NZ800 has an 85,217 to 1. Finally, just as another quick data point, we measured we wanted to figure out what the drop in light level output was from the color filter. So with the 700, and these are nits on my screen, the 700, this was calibrated the white point only, again, just to even that out. But this was not with the full calibration in there yet. So we pulled, with the filter out, the 700 gave us 95 nits on my screen. The 800 was at 145. When we put in the color filter, the 700 dropped to 77 nits and the 800 dropped to 103 nits. So both take a pretty decent hit, but the 700 takes a 19% drop in light and the 800 has a 29% drop in light. So difference there, yes, but the 800 is obviously, it's starting from a higher point, so it can afford to take more of a hit when you add that color filter in. The 500 is a non-factor on this measurement because it doesn't have the color filter. So now that we've given you kind of that raw data, I asked Kris a few questions on camera, and I'll let you hear kind of what Kris's thoughts are, not just on these two projectors, but on the 500 and 700s that he's calibrated so far since they've been in the market. You know, Kris calibrates a lot of projectors. He calibrates a lot of JVCs. So he's had a chance to see a lot of the samples, and you know, I wanted to get his thoughts on his overall impressions thus far as we look at these new projectors on the market.
I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's a nice new design. I like, you know, the compactness of it. It's still, you know, it's still a JVC. You know, at the end of the day, you're still getting, you know, the high dynamic range out of it. It's different, you know, obviously a different lens on there. As you saw, we're getting slightly higher on average mixed contrast levels. Sequential contrast was in the pretty much same ballpark, a little higher, but contrast potential with the 800 was still higher because of the fact that you have more light to work with when you're closing down the aperture and things like that. But yeah, I mean, I was surprised to see that JVC was going to put out a new projector that is a completely new chassis, considering that the chassis that they were using with the NX NZ and now NZ900 really is pretty new. You know, we're only a couple of generations in. But in all ways, it looks like, you know, a great projector. Again, like I've never been somebody that subscribes to the whole like, oh my God, it's a paradigm shift or whatever. But I think that the quality of the image that you're going to get, as long as you have the light output that you need for the screen size that you're doing, you know, like anybody that buys one would be probably pretty thrilled with it on average. If you look at like the mixed contrast stuff, it was like the 700 was a little better. Then it was like the 800, there was like that little shift and then it kind of went back. But I think like if you looked at the differences between the numbers as you go up in APL, how much of that you're going to notice, even in like a controller, like we talked about that earlier, you know, again, when you start getting into mixed contrast, as you get away from black, the room really plays a big part of that. But then also our contrast sensitivity changes dramatically as you're moving up in APL. So that's why I've always kind of been at that thing. It's like, yeah, as you go up higher, you know, these numbers get higher, but our contrast sensitivity in general goes down as we go up because of the way our eyes work. So it's always nice to plot a graph, but if you're not showing like how that relates to the way our eyes work and the, you know, that kind of functionality. But again, it is measuring higher. Now, whether or not, what the reason is for that, I've seen some people, again, we kind of talked about this, but some people talk about the E-shift element is something that has hurt mixed contrast. I don't really know if that's the case or not. I mean, we can still get pretty high mixed contrast, historically compared to any JVC that's been before with the 800, 900, and even the NZ9 before when it had that high contrast optical block. But unless you have this chassis optical system where you can compare one with E-shift and one without it, you're just saying like, oh, it's the E-shift element. Like, well, I mean, everything in it is changed. So how do you know it's that one thing? I would love to see that. So we can speculate on that all day. But at the end of the day, the numbers, they line up. You're getting similar contrast or better across most of the range. Your contrast potential is lower because, again, you don't have as much headroom in the light engine for it. But again, if your screen, you have light or headroom with one of these projectors, hey, it's a great option. I mean, if the NZ700 or even the 500, if they had the light that I need for one of my screens, I would honestly be just fine using one of those. But it doesn't quite have what I need for my situation, but it might be more than enough for other people. So it's just learning how to make that educated decision. Again, as long as you don't need the other features that they have. So, like 3D would probably be the biggest one because there are still a lot of people that 3D is pretty important for. So that would be one. If they like frame interpolation, obviously that's one. I don't remember if these have a low latency mode comparatively. So that might be a thing for gamers. Again, it just depends on, what those functions are. Now, as far as like the E-shift capability of it, again, like there is no 8K content out there. I said that when I did my first review of their 8K E-shift stuff. Obviously 4K 120 is part of that standard in terms of the bandwidth and stuff like that. But, again, like I know a lot of gamers that don't really think that 4K 120 is really that big of a deal either. The thing that I do like about the upper line compared to this line is, again, headroom. So if I'm thinking about, like, let's say I can put enough light up on this screen in your setup. So like in your setup, we're at 100% output and we're like, 85 nits or whatever, right? Well, with an NZ800, I would probably be able to put 85 nits up on your screen with less noise, or if I wanted the same amount of noise, I would be able to maybe use the color filter or maybe dial my aperture back and get a little bit more contrast. So there's advantages to that money. Now, whether or not the amount of money, I mean, we can play that game all day. Like, well, why do I buy a Barco or why do I buy a GTZ or why do I buy this? Headroom buys you things, but ultimately, do you need that headroom or not? No. But yeah, you're going to end up with, two options that are a much lower entry point that, deliver a fantastic image. That's hard to really compete with when you look at what this is trying to do and the things around it at that price point. So the 500 and 700 really they have two differences. One, the 500 has a single aperture in the lens, the in-lens aperture for trying to increase contrast. The 700 has one in the lens and one at the light engine. So a dual aperture like the 800, 900. So the contrast potential then goes up if you can take advantage of those. The other thing is the 700 has a color filter that the NZ500 does not have, and that extends your wide color gamut to basically about P3. So in your case, again, this being situational, you did not have enough light with the size screen that you have and the fact that it's a weave to take advantage of either the aperture, we had to fully open, or the color filter. And even with that, we ended up at about 85 nits. Now, I've said on AV boards and stuff before, like I'm in hundreds of rooms, I've done so many of these things. And the amount of people that actually have screens and projectors that can use color filters and aperture closing and stuff is such a small percentage, even though people think it's probably more than it is, but it's a really small percentage. I would say if anybody's using an aperture, they're lucky if they're getting to about a -4. Most of the time, it's like a -2 or 1. And color filters, again, people are buying bigger and bigger screens and then putting a projector up, and they need the light more than they need the color. Obviously, it'd be ideal to have both, but we don't have that. So in your case, because we're not using the color filter, you're giving up some gamut coverage compared to what you would have got with the 500. It's not a huge amount, but there is, it's not a trivial amount either. So you gave up a little bit of color for a little bit more light because we're not using the filter, you are getting slightly more light than you would have got out of the 500. So then it ultimately boils down to, well, what would you have noticed more, the brightness or the color? Probably the brightness, but sometimes people just like looking at a chart and saying like, oh, I've got all these boxes ticked, and stuff like that. So yeah, that it all goes back to, the trade-offs. And on paper, people talk about numbers all the time, but ultimately, like subjectively, without having anything to compare to or reference to, does it really matter as much as you think it matters? Because FOMO is a huge thing in this hobby, and I get it. Like we all suffer from it to one degree or the other. But I mean, ultimately, I still say whether it's a JVC, whether it's the newer Sony line, whether it's the new Epson line or whatever, we're in a golden age where like it's harder to find a bad projector than a good projector. Yes, they have their strengths and weaknesses. I personally, for the things that I like, really like the JVC line, but that doesn't mean that if I was stuck with a Sony that I'd be like, oh, the world is ending or whatever else. I'm just grateful to see that, we're seeing newer projectors come out, new designs coming out, and that, performance wise, you're getting, 80-90% of what you could get from an NZ900 that costs, 3 to 4 times as much as these projectors and stuff like that. So if you had a 700 with a lens, right, we would have had a little more headroom. So maybe we could have done some other things, just your peak white would have been a little higher, or you could have got a 500 with a lens for maybe, it depends on what lens we're talking about and things like that. In this case, I brought an ISCO 3. They don't make those anymore. You can find them on the used market. And obviously, you take the risk of, well, how good is the quality of that lens? But in this case, when we put the lens in place, we noticed that, measuring, with and without, we got about a 20% increase in light using that lens. And as you saw, that is a significant lens. I mean, it's probably weighs as much as the projector does and, the amount of glass that's in there. So, depending on what you're choosing, what your throw rates are and stuff like that, that is always an option. But there's other things. So, I always, as a dealer, I'm a Panamorph dealer. So I always, when people say, oh, I want to get a Panamorph, I've heard that it'll use all the resolution and all those things like that. And I'm like, I don't play the marketing game as much as some other people do. I look at an anamorphic lens purely mostly for the light gain. At the end of the day, that's what you're probably going to notice more than anything with it. So if I can get a 20 to 30% increase in light, but depending on the anamorphic lens you're talking about, you might be able to get a 20 to 30% increase in light just from a different screen at a lower price, depending, you know what I mean? You have to weigh the options you have. Lens, screen. Okay, this screen will give me that same amount and it's half the cost. But then, in your case, I have speakers behind it. So that becomes a thing. So, there's always different solutions that create other problems. So you have to find the one. But it was a fun experiment to try, at least to see like, what would this do, with a horizontal expansion, spherical lens like that. So. Sure.
One of the other things that I wanted to find out from Kris, as far as the samples that he's seen, is how JVC may be coming along when it comes in terms of the bright corners issue that they're kind of known for. And I don't know that there's a perfect projector out there, but JVC is kind of known for having a lot of projectors hitting the market that have bright corners, where if you're looking at a black screen, the 4 corners have an elevated black level. In my just eyeballing it on this projector, I haven't noticed that at all, but I wanted to see what he's noticed so far.
Oh, I definitely think that, when we start talking about historically, probably their most popular issue is the bright corners issue. And I mean, I got to be honest, I still see it. For something that was supposedly like kind of part of their new, marketing strategy and stuff. Have I seen units where I'm like, wow, they're pretty much not there? Absolutely. But I did see that with previous lines as well. I'm not, I kind of came out right in the beginning saying like, oh, contrast is pretty similar, light output's pretty similar. That I feel like the new line is more similar than different. Obviously, these are different because they're a lot different than what was before. But even there, I don't deal in that whole thing where it's like, oh, it's a night and day difference from an NZ7, or something like that. Are there differences? Absolutely. Um, but I've seen some that are really sharp. I've seen some that are a little on the soft side. I've seen some that have really good contrast. I've seen some that measure kind of more in the lower end of the contrast. And I've seen that across the 800s. I've seen that across the 900s. I've seen it across the NZ, 500s and the 700s as well. So, I would love to see a tighter QC in those ways. I'd love to see where bright corners just aren't an issue anymore. Uniformity things in general, more of a thing. But I also look at, again, the other brands out there and I'm like, well, it's not like if I go to this, all of these things disappear. I'm trading these problems for these problems. And are these problems going to bother me more? And I'm not saying like that whole, well, what about isms kind of thing like that. Like, just because somebody else doesn't mean that you should get away with it. I'd like to see everybody tighten up across the line and stuff like that. I just think that, again, having been in so many rooms and done so many, especially a lot of JVC, more often than not, like the things that, a handful of us can really focus on and really like, because that's what we do, I guess it's kind of the hobby of it. Other people are going like, I don't know what you're talking about, and stuff like that. And a lot of these, people really like to kind of use the dynamic laser dimming, which kind of makes all of it kind of null and void in the first place, because the place you're going to notice it the most is when that kicks in. And again, I'm not saying like, hey, I've always been a guy that like, I don't like processing trying to fix an inherent problem. I would much rather see them do more for that, especially as you move up the line. It's one thing when a $6,000 NZ500 has some quirks, like the lens could be a little tighter. I mean, $6,000 is still a lot of money for a projector, but when you're starting of talking about NZ900s that are $26,000, it becomes a lot harder to swallow when you're like, okay, like, this should be a clear step up in those regards and stuff where, like the QC on these, they were talking about like, oh, all the 500 and 700s are going through QC here in the States. I'm like, well, if there's any projector that every one of them should be going through QC, it's the one that's coming out the door at $26,000, not the one that's at 8, or all of them, or something along those lines. Or go back to the old days where there was the RS line versus the inline and stuff like that, where the RS was the reference series, where those did go through an extra. They had usually a longer warranty or more QC done with them at the factory. Maybe separate the lines again like that, where you pay a little bit extra for the RS for the people that are the nitpicky ones, but, show me that they're better, kind of thing like that. So,
and of course, another thing that we're seeing in these, kind of these first reports is some of the units are arriving with a stuck pixel. And actually, about 20 minutes after Kris left that day, I was sitting down here just looking at some content, some clips on the Kaleidoscape, and of course, guess what? Found a red pixel almost dead center in the screen that was stuck. And it's really shocking that neither one of us noticed it until I was watching a clip from Blade Runner 2049 and I saw it. So that's pretty disappointing, because I have to send this back and get a replacement. But it's also kind of going to be kind of fun to, we get to calibrate again. We get to play around with it again. I actually, the new JVCs have the feature where you can back up your settings to a thumb drive, and I've got them backed up on there. So I'm curious to see, since most of my calibration was actually done in Illumigen, when we calibrated the 3D LUT, we did it in the Illumigen, not in the projector. And so The projector is really just kind of calibrate. It's more the settings to be expecting the right format from the Lumagen. And the white point is calibrated in the projector. So I'm actually curious how much of this, how close I can get just by loading these settings onto a replacement when it arrives and just testing it before Kris comes to calibrate again. When I first got this, again, I had a calibration that was done in the Lumagen, but it was to a 7 or 8 year old projector. But because the Lumagen had most of the calibration, and the projector was really just white balanced for more or less, it was very watchable using the calibration from the Lumagen. Of course, we started from scratch on both of them with the new projector, and ignoring the stuck pixel in there, I can honestly say that this is just a really, really stunning image. It's going to be much improved over a projector as old as my other one was. It was a 4K E-shift. This is native 4K, but just the sharpness it's razor sharp, edge to edge. We did some work. Kris did some work aligning the panels, the RGB panels, and the sharpness is just really, really nice. The colors are fantastic. It's about the same level sound-wise as the X790R was in terms of noise in the room. I'm not lucky enough to have a hush box or really a good scenario where that would work in here, but it's not too bad. It's not that distracting except in the quietest scenes. My overall impressions have just been overwhelmingly positive on this projector. I took too long to upgrade, but it's a substantial upgrade, and I'm really enjoying the image, save for that stuck pixel. But that'll give us the chance to play around with it and recalibrate again, and I'll be able to see how comparable the two units might be by backing up the settings from this projector and just dropping it onto a thumb drive and putting it down to a new projector until Kris has a chance to come out and calibrate a new one. Most of my calibration is the 3D LUT done in the Lumagen processor. The projector itself is more the white balance. The white point is calibrated, and then it's all just kind of making it expect the right signal and stay locked into that signal from the Lumagen more than anything. So I'm kind of interested to see, I'll copy those settings over to the replacement projector and then have Kris measure it and see how close the replacement is with the exact same configuration before he calibrates that, and see maybe where are we from unit to unit in terms of consistency and that quality control. So it's disappointing that I have to swap it out and have him come back and calibrate it, but it gives us another data point to look at. It gives us another comparison unit. So yeah, other than that stuck pixel, it's just been phenomenal. From where it is in the back of my room, it's about an 18-foot throw. It's not a short throw. I'm using the Seymour and lighter Neo material, so it's not a unity. It's below unity gain screen, but I'm getting 85 nits on the screen, and would I like 100? Sure. Would I like 150? Absolutely. But 85, I think it's actually 86 is what the official measurement was. It is it's not disappointing at all to watch content at 86 nits with the size of the screen, the level of immersion that we have in this room, because we sit 9.5 feet from a 115-inch wide screen. So we're really about at that one-to-one ratio of viewing distance to screen width on scope. And it's just, it's fantastic. It makes me squint. The specular highlights are all there. There's nothing lacking. There's nothing that feels like it's missing. Could things pop a little brighter? I'm sure they could. Am I disappointed when I watch something? Absolutely not. So yeah, very, very happy with this purchase. Very excited to see, to get the next one in and see how similar they might be from unit to unit. Also, I've got some other really, really cool content that I'm going to be publishing here coming up. I've got a new Storm Audio ISR Fusion 20 on the way. That's going to be here any day. So I'll be talking about that a lot. I have two new Next Level Acoustics 15-inch subs that I'm going to have in here. So I'll be talking about those, of course. What else? Gosh, I've got, I wasn't expecting a lot of changes, but I've got a lot of changes and updates and fun stuff going on in the theater. So stay tuned here. Oh, the other one to mention is the Unfolded Circle Remote 3 is about to start shipping, and I should be in the first batch of those that come out. My backer number was in the first 75, and my shipping number in the queue is pretty much the same. So I'm expecting to get an early jump on that content. Really excited to see how that goes. I've been using the Remote 2 for about a year and a half now, and I've just really loved the build quality of it. Excited to get the new one with some tweaked software and firmware, using it with Home Assistant, which has been just rock solid. I'll be showing you how to connect the Storm receiver into Home Assistant. We'll be talking about the amps in the Storm receiver. Thinking about those giving me the ability to run my front soundstage at 500 watts per channel and everything else at 300 watts per channel is pretty astounding, knowing how good it sounds in here now with 80 watt per channel Emotiva amps running off of my Anthem. So yeah, I'm going to start doing some movie related content as well. I think the first one coming up here is going to be on a new film that's about to drop this weekend, I believe. It's called McVeigh, about Timothy McVeigh. A friend of mine is one of the producers on that, so we're going to get him in and talk about maybe some of the scenes and some of the action. I have it pre-ordered already on Kaleidoscape, so I want to watch it before we talk about it, but we'll be doing some stuff like that. We'll be discussing a lot of stuff on my channel here coming up. So make sure you like and subscribe. I'm really kind of sort of just launching this channel as a new venture to cover a lot of these things that I'm adding to this room, and it's mostly going to be this is going to be less about things that are sent me to review and just more about the things that I'm using daily, the things that live in my theater, not things that pass through for a quick hands-on, but things that are going to stay here and be a part of the Othello cinema. So I'm excited to talk about this stuff. I'm excited to tell you about this stuff. So make sure you like and subscribe, and we'll talk to you really soon. Thanks.